The paper arrived on a Tuesday in April of 1891, carried by a man named Dobbins who worked for the county clerk and who had the decency, at least, to hand it to her face rather than nail it to the door. Wayne West took it from him with both hands, read it through once without a word, and then read it a second time because the first reading had not made it less true. Harlan's name was at the bottom in his blocky, unhurried hand, and the county seal was at the top. And between those two fixed points were the legal sentences that said the deeded land was his by prior record, and she had 30 days to quit the property. Dobbins looked at his hat. "I'm sorry, Mrs. West," he said, which was kind of him, and she thanked him for it, which surprised him enough that he left quickly. She stood on the porch of the house she had helped build and looked across the yard she had kept for 9 years and felt something settle in her chest the way a stone settles through cold water, slow and without drama, coming to rest at the bottom. She was 31 years old. She owned a bedroll, a cast-iron skillet, a canvas sack of dried beans, a folding knife, a good iron chisel, a medium iron chisel, a small one, a hand drill, and a mule named Solomon who had been her mother's mule before he was hers, and who would, she already knew, come with her when she left. She also owned 3 sheets of folded paper that had lived at the bottom of her flour tin for 9 years, because that was where her mother Della had kept important things, out of sight, clean, and available when needed. If you have found this channel and this story, you already know something about waiting for the world to admit it was wrong. Stay with me, because the admission is coming, and it arrives in a way that the men on Orville Pruitt's porch could not have predicted if they had tried for 100 years. Her mother had been a woman who read the land the way a good reader reads a page, not for what was written on the surface, but for what was meant by it. Della had grown up on the mesa country to the west, in country where water was the only thing that mattered, and where everyone who survived long enough learned to think about water constantly, not as a resource to be grateful for when it arrived, but as a force to be managed, redirected, and respected even in its absence. Della had carved 3 cisterns into a sandstone outcrop behind the yard of her own small holding, and she had cut channels into the rock above each one, shallow trenches angled at 5 degrees, following the natural slope of the cliff face, so that rain sheeting down the stone was guided away from the opening and into a collection basin, rather than pouring straight through the cistern's mouth and silting it full. She had done this with iron tools and patience, and a knowledge of how water moved that she had learned from watching, over years, where the ground was dry after rain and where it was not. She had explained this to Wayne when Wayne was 11 years old, standing at the cistern mouth with a hand placed flat against the rock wall, tracing the cut channel with one finger. "Water does what the stone tells it," she said, "unless you tell it something different first." And then she had shown her how to read the slight discoloration on a cliff face that meant a seep, and how to find the natural fracture lines that showed where stone would split cleanly and where it would not, and how to hold a chisel so that the blow drove forward and slightly down rather than straight in, which prevented the blade from catching in the cut and throwing your hand wrong. When Della died in the winter of 1882, she had left Wayne no money and no land and nothing that could be sold, because there was nothing of that kind to leave. What she left instead were those 3 sheets of folded paper, covered in her careful penciled sketches of channel angles, load estimates, and drainage flow paths for a cliff face she had surveyed the summer before she became ill and had never returned to finish. She had also left Solomon, who was then a young animal, with strong opinions about the pace of work and about carrots, and who had not changed substantially in the 9 years since. Wayne took the paper from Dobbins on Tuesday. She spent Wednesday and Thursday in the house, moving quietly through the rooms, taking nothing that was not hers by provenance rather than by use. which meant almost nothing. On Friday, she loaded Solomon with the bedroll, the skillet, the chisel set, and hand drill, the beans, the flour tin with Della's sketches inside it, and a coil of rope. Harlan watched from the far side of the yard, near the fence, with his hands in his pockets, and said nothing while she worked. When she was finished loading, she led Solomon to the gate, and he said, "I suppose you have somewhere in mind." "I do," she said. She led Solomon west out of town on the road that turned to 2 tracks and then to nothing, following the canyon corridor that her mother had taken her through once, when she was small, and that she had not forgotten because certain things about stone country stay with a person once they have been shown. The canyon walls were pale orange and cream, sandstone laid down in long horizontal strata that caught the afternoon light and held it warmly. The kind of rock that cut predictably and held its edge once cut, provided you did not rush it and did not expect more than the stone was willing to give. She found the face she was looking for on the 3rd day of travel, on a south-facing stretch of cliff where a natural recess had already begun the work for her, a concavity roughly 4 feet deep and 8 feet wide, set into the base of the wall at a height that was level with her chest. The rock above it overhung just enough to shed a light rain, and the strata below it even and close-grained. The land in the canyon bottom was unpatented federal ground, with no survey stake visible for half a mile in either direction, which meant it was available to anyone willing to occupy it. She considered the face for a long time, measuring it with her eyes and with the flat of her hand pressed against the stone, feeling the grain and the temperature and the slight give of a surface fracture. She traced with 2 fingers. She tied Solomon to a juniper 30 feet back, put water in his bucket, and began to work. The work was slow and it was specific. She cut inward 14 feet before she stopped, measuring depth with a knotted cord tied to a stake at the original face. She cut the floor level and swept it clean with a cedar branch as she went, so she could read what the rock was telling her about the stratum she was working through. 3 times in the first month, she encountered a fault line that would have opened into a fissure if she had driven straight through it, and each time she adjusted the angle of her cut to run parallel with the fault until it closed again, following the safe path the stone showed her. Solomon watched all of this with the particular expression of a mule who has seen stranger things and who has his own opinions about the likelihood of success, but who will, in the meantime, stand where he is told to stand. By late June, the recess had become a room, 9 feet wide and 14 feet deep, and 6.5 feet tall at the crown, with a lintel she had smoothed and squared as carefully as any carpenter might square a timber. She had set a low stone bench along the north interior wall by rooting out 2 horizontal slots and fitting flat slabs into them, and she had cut a narrow ventilation slot at the back wall, upper left, angled to catch the prevailing draft without admitting rain. There was no door, because she had not yet acquired the materials for one, but the opening was framed cleanly, and a person standing inside could see a long reach of the canyon in both directions. It was sometime in early July that Orville Pruitt first saw it. Orville owned the drover's dry goods store in the town of Callow, which sat on the flat ground above the canyon rim, and he spent his mornings on the porch of that store with 3 or 4 other men of similar habits and confidence. He had ridden down the canyon track on a business errand of his own, and he had stopped his horse and looked at the carved opening in the cliff face, and at the woman with a chisel and mallet working the frame, and he had looked at her for a long time before he said anything. "Mrs. West," he said, though he knew perfectly well she had taken back her mother's name, "are you making yourself a hole in that wall?" "I am carving a dwelling," she said without turning around. He sat on his horse for another moment. "How deep is it?" 14 feet. He was quiet. Then he said, 14 feet into solid rock. Yes. He turned his horse and rode back up the canyon, and 2 days later, the porch at Drover's Dry Goods had its name for what she was building. They called it West's Hole, and the humor of it pleased them enough that it went around the town quickly. The way things do when they satisfy a need to reduce something to a size that does not require understanding. She heard it from Celia Pruitt 3 weeks later. Celia had come down the canyon track alone, which was unusual, carrying a small wrapped parcel that turned out to contain a jar of preserved plums and a folded note that said nothing except the woman's name. Celia was a compact, watchful woman who had grown up in mining country and who looked at Wayne's carved room with an expression that was not mockery. "It is a tidy piece of work," Celia said. "It will be tidier," Wayne said. Celia sat on the stone bench inside and looked at the walls and the ceiling for a while, the way a person looks when they are actually seeing a thing rather than looking at it. Then she said, "Orville thinks it will flood. He says this part of the canyon takes water." "I know it does," Wayne said. "He thinks that's an argument against it." "He would," Wayne said. Celia left the plums and went home. 3 days after that, she raised the issue at the porch in front of Orville and the men assembled there, and said that the West woman's carving was solid work by any measure, and that perhaps the mockery had gone far enough. The men on the porch listened to her politely, which is to say they let her finish before resuming the conversation they had been having, and Orville explained patiently that a 14-foot hole in a sandstone wall was not a structure by any definition he was prepared to accept, and that a woman who had been turned out of a legitimate property to live in a cliff face was a woman whose judgment deserved a certain kind of pity rather than a certain kind of respect. Celia did not raise the issue a second time because she knew the architecture of that porch well enough to know that a thing said once into it did not benefit from repetition. Word of West's Hole traveled out along the wagon roads the way words do in a canyon country town, carried by drivers and herders and the occasional survey rider, and it collected a small catalog of jokes that Wayne heard secondhand because she no longer came into Callow except for iron stock and lamp oil. She heard that Orville had taken to asking customers if they had visited the local frontier woman's underground parlor. She heard that Harlan had said, when someone mentioned it to him, that a woman who chose to live in a hole in a wall was welcome to that choice, and that his own opinion of it was not fit for polite company, which made the assembled listeners laugh. She was, during this time, carving the channels. She had saved the channels for last because they were the most technical part of the work, and because she had wanted the face of the stone above the lintel to be fully settled and dry before she made the cuts that would govern how water moved across it. In the winter of 1891 and into the early spring of 1892, she studied Della's sketches by lamp in the evenings and made her own measurements of the cliff face above the opening, noting the natural drainage line that appeared as a faint mineral stain after the light rains of November, a stripe of darker stone running from a point 3 feet above and 2 feet left of the lintel's center, angling down toward the right edge of the opening. Without intervention, a heavy rain sheeting down that face would funnel directly into the room along that line, carrying silt and debris and the kind of sustained saturation that would undermine the stone. She cut 2 channels into the face above the lintel, working from Della's sketch angles, which specified a cut 4 inches wide, 2 inches deep, and angled 7 degrees away from the opening on each side, following the existing contour of the face so that water arriving from above would find the channels before it found the opening and would follow them outward and downward to the edges of the recess, where it would fall freely to the canyon floor on either side of the entry. She cut the channels in February and March when the stone was cold and held its edge best, working in short sessions because cold hands lose their feel. And she tested the cuts with poured water from a bucket, watching where the flow went and adjusting the angle slightly where it did not go where the sketch said it should go. When the water ran clean from both channels without touching the lintel, she set down the chisel for the last time and sat on the stone bench in the room she had made and ate half a flatbread she had cooked that morning on the skillet. And Solomon watched from outside with his long face framed in the opening. The spring of 1892 was dry, and then the summer was drier. And then in late July, a series of storms built along the ranges to the north and east, in the way that storms in canyon country build when the monsoon season has been held back for weeks by a persistent high-pressure ridge. Slowly, with the pressure dropping a little each day, until the ridge fails and the accumulated weather comes through all at once. Wayne watched the sky through the first 3 days of August and felt the change in the air the way her mother had taught her to feel it, not as a single dramatic shift, but as a slow accumulation of small signals, the particular weight of the air against the back of the hand, the way sound traveled differently in the canyon before water, the smell of wet caliche arriving well before any cloud was visible overhead. On the evening of August 3rd, she checked the drainage channels with a lamp, running her finger along each cut, finding them clear and properly angled, the cuts she had made in February still sharp-edged and sound. She brought Solomon's water bucket inside the room and brought his grain sack in and brought in the lamp oil and the flour tin and the extra blanket and the coil of rope and the skillet, packing the interior of the room with reasonable care. And then she sat at the opening and watched the northern sky go dark in a way that was not the dark of evening. The rain started on the night of August 3rd and did not stop. It rained 2 days north of Callow and above the canyon system, in the high country where the arroyos that fed the main canyon had their headwaters, and the rain up there was not the gentle soaking rain of a normal monsoon, but the hard-driving, sustained kind that does not pause long enough for the ground to accept it. By the morning of August 5th, the creek in the canyon bottom, which ran 4 inches deep in a dry summer, had risen to 18 inches and was carrying red-brown water loaded with sand and uprooted brush. By mid-morning, it was at 3 feet and moving fast, and the sound it made against the canyon walls had changed from the sound of water to something lower and more insistent, like a millstone working in a mill that has been given more grain than it can take. In the town of Callow on the canyon rim, things were not yet dangerous because the town sat high enough above the canyon bottom that the flood itself would not reach them. What the flood would reach were the things people had in the canyon, the corrals and tool sheds and the lower outbuildings that had been built over time along the canyon floor, because canyon bottom land was flat and convenient, and the floods came irregularly enough that a person could convince himself, over a season or 2 of dry years, that the risk was acceptable. 3 corrals went in the first surge, carrying with them 27 head of cattle and a string of 8 horses that had not been moved to higher ground in time. A timber frame storage building belonging to a man named Garvey went sideways into the water and broke apart at the corner joints within minutes of the water reaching its foundation, because the posts had been set in earth, and the earth, saturated, gave them nothing to hold to. Garvey himself was on the rim watching it go. Wayne was below the rim. She had left the room at first light and gone up the canyon track toward the flatter ground, where she had seen 2 of the Hensley family's goats wandering loose the day before. She found them in a shallow draw 200 yards up the track, confused and wet, and disinclined to move, and she gathered them with a length of rope looped around the neck of the larger one, and she was bringing them back toward the room when the canyon bottom sound changed from dangerous to something that required faster thinking. The water came around the upper bend carrying the bulk of what it had already collected, trees and planks, and the collapsed side of something that had been a structure, and it was filling the canyon floor from wall to wall at a depth she could not read exactly. But that was deep enough to make the juniper Solomon was tied to look like a shrub. She cut the goats loose, because there was no help for them at the speed things were moving, and she ran back to Solomon and untied him and got him moving by force of her voice and her palm flat against his flank. And he moved, which said something about how much he trusted her, because Solomon's instinct in any uncertain situation was to stand still and consider his options at length. She got him inside the room and tied him to the stone bench with 2 loops of the rope, and then she climbed out onto the sandstone face above the opening, using the small hand-cut foothold she had put in over the winter for exactly this kind of access, and she watched the water come. It came around the lower bend fast and brown, and full of the wreckage of other people's decisions about where to build and what was permanent. It filled the canyon floor to a depth of 6 feet at its peak, which meant it covered the lower 2 feet of the room's opening, and came over the entry threshold and spread thin and cold across the stone floor inside. But it did not enter with the force of a river. It entered the way floodwater enters a space that has been prepared to receive a controlled portion of it, finding its level, moving without aggression, because the water that should have poured in from above, the sheeting surface water running down the cliff face in a gray curtain, was finding the channels she had cut and following them outward to either side of the opening and falling in 2 clean streams to join the flood below. The room took 8 inches of water on its floor. No more. Wayne stood on the footholds above the lintel in the rain and watched this, and she thought of Della's finger tracing the channel cut, and she thought, yes, that is exactly right. When the water began to fall, around mid-afternoon of August 5th, she came down from the footholds and waded into the room and checked Solomon, who was standing in 8 inches of water with an expression of complete moral disapproval directed at her. And she checked the walls and the ceiling and the lintel and found no new cracking and no structural change of any kind. The stone bench was above the water line. The flour tin was on the bench and dry. She was wringing out the lower half of her skirt when she heard the first voices. The Hensley brothers came first, Ned and Carl, following the canyon rim track down to the lower path that circled back toward the cliff face, both of them on foot and wet to the waist. Carl had a gash on his forearm from a fence wire that had come loose in the water, and he was holding it with his other hand. Wayne got them inside, checked Carl's arm and wrapped it with a strip of her spare shirt, and put them on the stone bench on either side of Solomon, who was willing to share the space now that the water level was dropping. The Garvey family came next, husband and wife and their oldest daughter, all 3 carrying what they could from their ruined storehouse. Mrs. Garvey looked around the room with the methodical attention of a woman inventorying a space for practical use, not astonishment, and immediately began helping Wayne move the remaining standing water toward the opening with the heel of a plank board. Then Harlan came. He came alone, and he was not hurt, but he was shaken in a way that was not about physical shock, the kind of shaken that comes from having believed something firmly for a long time, and having the ground removed from beneath that belief inside a single afternoon. He stood at the opening of the room and looked at Wayne inside it, at the stone walls and the fitted lintel and the clean lines of the channel work above the frame, and at Solomon standing in the subsiding water with his rope lying slack, and at the neighbors arranged on the bench and on the floor. And he said nothing for a long time. "Come in out of the rain, Harlan," Wayne said. He came in. It was a further hour before Orville arrived, which surprised nobody who knew Orville, because Orville was a man who needed time to assemble his understanding of a situation before he entered it, and the situation at the carved room in the cliff face required more assembly time than most. He came down the path with his hat in his hand and stood at the threshold where the last of the floodwater was draining away across the canyon floor below, and he looked at the opening and at the 2 channels above the lintel, the water still running out of them in separate streams, clean and controlled, going exactly where the stone directed them. He looked at this for some time. Wayne stood in the opening. Orville turned his hat once in his hands, front to back. He looked at the channels again. He looked at the people visible inside. His wife, Celia, not among them because Celia was on the rim and safe. He looked at Wayne. Celia said it was tidy work, he said. She was right, Wayne said. He stepped across the threshold into the room, and that was the whole of it. There was no speech. There was no accounting. There was a man who had spent a year calling a woman's work a hole standing inside that work with water draining from his boots, and the stone walls standing around him without comment, and the lintel above the entry firm and unblemished, and the channels outside routing the last of the rain cleanly away from everything he was standing in. That was enough. The room said the rest. Celia came down the path in the early evening after the flood peak had fully receded, carrying bread and a covered pot of something hot that turned out to be salt pork and dried corn, because Celia was a practical woman who understood that people who had spent an afternoon in a flash flood were hungry people. She looked around the room with the expression she had worn the previous summer when she had first sat on the stone bench and said it was tidy work, except that now the expression included something that had not been there then. A long exhale of a look, the kind a person gives when they said a thing once, were ignored and have now lived to see it confirmed. She sat on the bench beside Orville and did not say anything about having said it first. She did not need to. They stayed in the carved room that night, all of them, and Wayne fed Solomon from the grain sack and built a small fire in the ventilation slot's draft, which drew the smoke cleanly up through the back wall cut and out into the evening air, and the room was warm and dry, and 14 feet deep into solid sandstone, while the canyon below them was still running with the last of the floodwater, carrying away the remnants of the year's confident assumptions about where to build and what would hold. In the weeks that followed, the talk in Callow changed its shape. It did not change all at once, and it did not change without resistance, because towns are not in the habit of reversing themselves quickly, particularly about things they have held up for mockery at the best porch in town. What changed first was the specific language. A rider from the county seat who came through in September to assess flood damage stopped at the carved room and measured the channel cuts with a folding rule and wrote something in his record book. And when he asked Wayne what she called the method, she told him it was her mother's method, based on Della's reading of the cliff face drainage. And he wrote that down too. By October, the rider had described the channels at a public assessment meeting in Callow, and the name West's Hole did not appear in that description. The rider called it the West Carving, which was a plain and accurate description that contained no joke, and the name arrived in the town's ordinary speech and stuck there, the way accurate names do when they have stopped competing with the funny ones. Harlan came back to the carved room 3 weeks after the flood, alone, without a hat, and without the quality of composure he had worn so reliably for the 9 years she had known him. He stood at the threshold and said he wanted to know how the channels were cut, because he had 2 outbuildings on a slope above a drainage path, and he was willing to learn what could be learned. Wayne showed him because that was the kind of woman she was, the kind who extends more grace to the people who wronged her than those people ever extended to her, not from weakness but from the understanding that a lesson learned by someone who previously refused to learn it is worth more to the region than a lesson kept private out of justified resentment. She showed him the angle of the cut, 7 degrees, and the width, 4 inches, and the placement relative to the natural drainage line on the face, and she showed him Della's sketches, which she spread on the stone bench and let him study. He looked at the sketches for a long time, and then he looked at the channels above the lintel, and then he said, "Your mother drew these." "She did." "And you kept them 9 years." "I did." He was quiet for a while. "I should not have served you that paper," he said. "No, she said. "You should not have." That was the whole of that, too. Over the next few years, the channel principle moved through the canyon country, the way practical knowledge moves in a place where the land does not accommodate mistakes kindly, which is to say it moved through the hands and the conversation of the people who had good reason to learn it, rather than through any formal transmission. The Hensley brothers cut channels above the doorway of their root cellar before the following summer and found, during the next monsoon season, that the cellar stayed dry in a rain that would previously have sent 6 inches of water across its floor. Garvey rebuilt his storage building on a different site entirely and asked Wayne to look at the drainage above the site before he poured the foundation, which she did, and which saved him 3 weeks of misjudgment. Celia Pruitt brought 2 women from the Methodist Ladies' Society to see the carved room in the autumn of 1893, not as a curiosity but as an instructional visit, and Wayne spread Della's sketches on the bench and explained the drainage principle the same way Della had explained it to her at the cistern mouth in 1871, with a hand flat against the stone and a finger tracing the cut channel. The women listened and asked questions that were good questions, the kind that came from paying attention rather than from a need to be seen paying attention, and they left with paper copies of the sketch angles in their coat pockets. The rider from the county seat included the west carving and its drainage channels in a formal survey record he filed in the early summer of 1893, describing the method in enough detail that a person with tools and patience could replicate it from the description alone. He noted the date of construction, the approximate depth of the chamber, and the specific angle of the channel cuts, and he noted that the structure had survived the August 1892 flood without structural compromise, while 3 timber frame outbuildings within a quarter mile had been destroyed and 2 corrals had been lost entirely. He noted the method's source as Della's drainage reading practice, learned in Mesa country to the west, and he recorded Wayne's name in full, which was by that point her mother's name again, held clean and unencumbered. The years that came after were not easy years, because that country did not offer easy years, but they were years in which Wayne was not dismissed. The carved room in the cliff face became a place people stopped when they were passing through the canyon, not to marvel at it exactly, but to stand in it for a moment and consider what it meant to read the stone correctly, and what it cost a person to be right about something before the evidence arrived that made being right affordable. Wayne added a fitted timber door in 1894, made from canyon juniper, and a second stone bench on the south wall, and a small stone shelf for the lamp. Solomon lived another 11 years after the flood, going gray around his eyes and muzzle, but never changing his opinion about the pace of work or about carrots, and he spent those years between the juniper he was tied to and the stone bench inside, standing at the threshold in the evenings with his chin resting on the lintel as if he were considering the canyon with the same patient attention that his owner had always given it. The knowledge did not stay in the canyon. It traveled the way Wayne's mother had always said, knowledge travels when it is genuine. Not by announcement, but by result. A man in the next county overbuilt drainage channels above his root cellar door in 1895, after hearing the account from a freighter who had stopped at the drover's porch, and his cellar stayed dry in a season that took 2 of his neighbors' cellars. A family in the hill country to the south used Della's angle specifications, which by then had circulated far enough that a person could hear them described with a degree of inaccuracy that told you they had passed through several sets of hands and adapted them to a different stone type and a different drainage problem, and found that the principle still held because the principle was about water, and water does not change its nature by county or by decade. Orville Pruitt came to the carved room a second time in the spring of 1895, this time with his hat on, and with the manner of a man who has worked out, over 3 years of private thought, that he owes a person a different kind of attention than he previously gave her. He had a question about the drainage above a stone-faced cellar he was having built at the back of the drover's store, and he asked the question plainly and without performing the asking. Wayne answered it plainly. He thanked her. He did not apologize for the porch or for West's hole or for the years of patient, mild ridicule he had extended so freely, because that was not the kind of man he was, and she had not expected it, because she had never required his apology to know the value of what she had built. But the visit itself was a kind of settling, the way a stone settles through cold water, and she let it settle without comment. Della's 3 sheets of folded sketches lived in the flower tin on the stone shelf beside the lamp until 1897, when Wayne took them out and made 5 careful copies, tracing the pencil lines with her own hand and adding the notes she'd accumulated from 4 years of observing how the channel principle behaved in different stone conditions, and she gave 4 of those copies away, to Celia, to the Hensley family, to the county writer who had recorded the survey, and to a young woman of 17 named Pearl, who had come to the canyon the previous winter from somewhere to the north, and who had stood at the threshold of the carved room with the look of someone memorizing a thing she expected to need. The original 3 sheets stayed in the tin on the shelf. They were still there the last time anyone thought to look. The carved room in the cliff face stood for decades after Wayne West cut the last chisel mark into its walls, through seasons that brought floods and dry years, and the slow traffic of people who found the canyon and stopped, and the sandstone held the form of the work the way sandstone holds any careful cut, cleanly and without apology, the grain of the stone showing the direction of each stroke in the low morning light when the sun came level through the opening and crossed the floor in a warm bar from threshold to back wall. The 2 channels above the lintel held their angle and their edge, because stone that has been cut correctly in cold weather and cleared regularly does not lose its purpose to time at the pace of softer things. In the evenings, in the years after Solomon was gone, the canyon held its own sounds, the creek running low and steady in the dry months, the particular silence of a sandstone wall cooling after a hot day, the sound of wind moving through the juniper a person would still have recognized as the same juniper, grown thicker now and spreading. 14 feet of solid stone remembered nothing and required nothing, and kept everything inside it exactly as it had been left, cool and dry and cut true to the sketch angles of a woman who had learned them from a woman who had learned them from the land itself. The principle was the inheritance. The room was the proof, and on a still morning, when the light came through the opening at the right angle and crossed the stone bench and the shelf and the flower tin sitting on it, the room looked like what it was, a place made by a person who read the stone correctly and was willing to wait for the world to read her the same way, with the patience of water finding a cut channel, going exactly where it had been shown to go, no faster and no less. Solomon's old rope still hung from the bench bracket in the corner, frayed at the ends, holding the shape of all the knots she had tied in it, and the canyon beyond the opening was bright with morning.